When I was on the progressive path, which I was for over 20 years, and we took our teaching from Sri Shantananda Saraswati, I think you know, it was always said that liberation, or I think the term you use is recognizing your true nature, that could only come by grace, and you can't do it. It just happens by grace, and I think quite a lot of contemporary teachers would say a similar thing, and Christianity does as well. So when you use this term, walking your way back to your true nature, I'm just trying to square this. Can you help?
Yes. Okay. So you feel that this walking your way back to your true nature would be rather the opposite of grace, a great effort that the individual makes to achieve.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, because the individual or the ahankara, the fabricated self, is aiming for a place of pure being.
Yes.
Okay. How can a doing become a being?
Okay. Okay, I need to introduce you to John Smith and King Lear. Are you familiar with John Smith and King Lear, Colin? Have
no.
You heard? No. Okay. Well, apologies. Those of you that are familiar with John Smith and King Lear, I'll just briefly. It's an analogy that I use, but it's a very efficient analogy. It has great explanatory power in relation to this and other questions. So John Smith is an actor. He lives a peaceful life alone at home. And he goes to the theatre one night to play the part of King Lear. He goes to his theatre, he puts on King Lear's costume, he adopts King Lear's thoughts and feelings, and he seems to become King Lear without, of course, ever ceasing to be John Smith. So he plays the role of King Lear. He becomes King of England. He's got 3 daughters. He's in conflict with his daughters. He suffers terribly as a result. And at the end of the play, so fully has he played the part of King Lear that he loses himself completely to the part. In other words, he forgets that he is John Smith, and to all intents and purposes, he becomes King Lear. Of course, he never really becomes King Lear because there is no character called King Lear. King Lear is just a self-assumed limitation of that John Smith himself freely assumes. So at the end of the performance, he goes backstage to change. His friend comes to congratulate him on his appearance and finds him miserable. And so he says, "Oh, why are you miserable?" And so King Lear says to him, "Because I have such a terrible relationship with my daughters." And his friend says, "Well, what do you mean you're not miserable because of your relationship with your daughters?" And then King Lear begins to explain the troubles of his kingdom and relationships. And their friend says, "No, don't be silly. You're not miserable because of your relationship with your daughters. You're miserable because you have forgotten who you truly are. Who are you really?" And so King Lear says, "Well, I'm the father of 3 daughters. I'm the King of England." And his friend says, "No, you're being a father of 3 daughters and being the King of England is not essential to you. They've been added to you. Who are you essentially? So King Lear then begins to describe his thoughts and his feelings, and his friend says to him, no, your thoughts and your feelings are not always with you. They don't define who you essentially are. And his friend is of course teaching him self-inquiry. King Lear is beginning to walk himself back in his experience, closer and closer and closer to who he really is. And as he does so, King Lear goes through these layers in himself. And each time his friend asks himself who he is, he finds it more and more difficult to describe. There are longer and longer pauses or silences in their conversation. As King Lear begins to find, well, who am I really? What is it that is essential? What am I before I was a father of 3 daughters or the King of England? And then at some point in the conversation, there is this recognition, I am John Smith. And at that moment, King Lear's suffering comes to an end. So, that's the background, that's the analogy. John Smith is, of course, our essential being. King Lear is, of course, the person that our essential being clothes itself in: our thoughts, our feelings, our activities, our relationships, all these elements of our experience that are not essential to us, but clothe or colour our essential, irreducible self. So, just as King Lear, clothed in the costume and thoughts and feelings of King Lear, seems to become King Lear, he limits himself in the form of King Lear, so our being assumes the forms, or the clothes of thoughts, feelings, activities and relationships, and as a result seems to limit itself. So we seem to become a limited being, and our being is limited by our thoughts, feelings, activities and relationships, just as previously John Smith was limited by the costumes and the thoughts and activities of King Lear. So, does the revelation, I am John Smith, occur as a result of grace? In other words, just does John Smith do it? Or as a result of effort? In other words, does King Lear do it? Who is it that walks all the way back from King Lear's suffering to the recognition, I am John Smith, and the peace that comes with that recognition? Who undertakes the journey? Does King Lear undertake the journey? No. There is no person called King Lear. King Lear is only King Lear from his own illusory point of view. It is only King Lear that believes, I am King Lear. So as long as King Lear believes, I am King Lear, he feels, I am walking myself back to the recognition, I am John Smith. Exactly the same way the separate self believes, I am practicing self-inquiry. I am walking myself back to my true nature. But who is it that has the recognition, I am John Smith? Does King Lear have that experience, or does John Smith have that experience?
John Smith.
John Smith. King Lear cannot have the recognition, I am John Smith, because as soon as the recognition, I am John Smith, takes place, King Lear ceases to be. In fact, he doesn't cease to be. There never was a person called King Lear. So there's no question of King Lear ceasing to be. King Lear is not a person or an entity in his own right. He is the activity of John Smith. But he doesn't know that. He thinks he's a person in his own right. And as long as he thinks he's a person in his own right, he, the person he believes and feels himself to be, has to take the journey. When the recognition, I am John Smith, takes place, with that recognition comes the understanding, I was never really King Lear. King Lear was just a self-assumed and imaginary limitation. But there was never a real person called King Lear who left John Smith and then returned to John Smith. It was John Smith himself who freely limited himself in the form of King Lear and then divested himself of that limitation. In other words, John Smith did everything in exactly the same way. Everything is grace. But grace, when viewed from the perspective of the separate self, feels like effort. So grace, effort, is just what grace looks like from the point of view of the separate self.
I see. Thank you.
So there's no conflict between making efforts and grace. We feel the efforts we make to return to our true nature, we feel, I am taking the journey back to our true nature. We don't yet know that it is God who is reeling us in. We think we're taking the journey. No, the separate self does nothing. There is no separate self, either to do something or not to do something. It is God's being that clothes itself in limitations and seems to become a separate self. And then God's being undresses itself, divests itself of its limitations. That is the process of grace, which, from the illusory perspective of the separate self, feels like effort. So if you feel that you need to make the effort, but know that it is always God who is doing it.
That's perfect. Thank you.